Gentlemen, we're moving on to the notes.
Ow!
Take a seat, gentlemen. I am moving on to the notes. This is the other thing I'm going to check to make sure you guys have done for today's lesson.
Wait, what? We're done after this?
No, this is the other thing I'm checking for engagement is your notes. Have you copied them down? All right. So, something that we need to talk about is our discussion. So what is the discussion?
We're talking about goddamn chemistry of investigation of a science.
The science of observation.
So, yes, the science behind our observations. So discussion is using science
Yes, we got all.
to explain the results.
Using scientific knowledge.
So I'm going to give you guys some scientific knowledge so that way you guys can write your discussions when you do your experiment next week. And also we're going to be talking about that muffin experiment because that'll help us understand why we saw what we saw. So some things to note is that we have acids. And we know that acids have a low pH and that they taste sour. Now, something new that you guys got off of the sheet the other day was that acids release hydrogen ions, so H plus ions. The other thing we talked about were bases. I'm just going to change the lighting on that. So bases are basically the opposite. They have a high pH. They taste bitter. And they can do two things. They can absorb hydrogen ions. Or the other thing is they can release OH ions, which are known as hydroxide. So those are some characteristics of acids and bases. Can I move it?
No.
Or you guys still need the purple? I know you just started. You guys a sec to process that. So acids and bases. pH is really important to think about. Hydrogen ions, hydroxide ions, all those things help us understand what is going on. The spaghetti recipe that I'm picking up. Good job, guys. See you often. Thank you.
I remember when we did a lot.
Doing a quick wander around the seat.
Huh?
Alright, you gone?
Mine. Right?
Alright, so when we mix an acid and base together, they neutralize. They cancel each other out.
Oh. Yes, it did.
So that neutralization is what we talk about with that pH being 7. Which makes sense because when we look at what they do, we see one releases hydrogen ions and one absorbs them. So you see how they're going to cancel each other out. Now, there's several different types of neutralization reactions. We can have just a plain acid plus a base. Trying to think what colors I want to use. So we're gonna have an acid plus a base being mixed together, and when they get mixed together, sometimes they just form a salt and they form water, and that neutralizes it. Sometimes when they're mixed together, we can have an acid plus a base. Now, a really specific base that we're thinking about is a carbonate base. And when those two things get mixed together, we get a salt, we get water, but the third thing we get is a gas, which is carbon dioxide. Now, if we're thinking back to our muffin experiment, and you know how the muffins rose? It rose because of those carbon dioxide bubbles. That's the gas, and that caused the muffins to rise. So there were two good ones. What were the two best ones, if you guys remember, when we did the test? Which two did the best?
Blue and yellow.
The blue and the yellow. So the blue had the baking powder, and the yellow had the vinegar and baking soda. So just so you guys are aware, vinegar is an example of an acid. You can mix it with baking soda, which is our base. And you see how those two would bubble together and form a gas? And that's why that muffin rose really well. The other muffin that you guys had that rose really well was your baking powder. You guys know what baking powder is?
Yes.
What is it?
It was baking powder.
It's baking powder. Do you know what makes up baking powder?
Baking soda.
Baking soda. And do you know what else?
Baking powder.
And an acid, some acid. Normally it's cream of tartar. So do you see how the ones that rose were the ones that had both the acid and the base? Which one tasted sour? The vinegar one. And we know that vinegars are an acid, and do acids taste sour?
Yes.
Yeah, so that makes sense to why the vinegar muffin tasted sour. The baking soda one that just had baking soda, that one tasted bitter. And that was just because baking soda is a base. So we see why the muffins tasted the way they tasted. And why some of them rose and some of them didn't rise. Are we good so far? Pretty cool, huh? So now you guys know why your muffins rose and didn't rise. And the main thing is that carbon dioxide needed to be formed. If it didn't form carbon dioxide, it didn't bubble. And thus, so yeah. Also, when you tasted the muffins, the baking soda one tasted the best because the acid and base were at the right ratios to cancel out, and thus you didn't taste that bitter or that sour. With the vinegar and baking soda one, that one might have still tasted a little funny because we didn't get the right ratios of acid and base. So it might have rose, but it didn't cancel out the flavor of the vinegar, for example. So you can use that as an explanation. Questions, concerns, comments? We're good? All right, I'm gonna add an extra note so you guys are ready for your assessment next week. And you'll see this in when you do your experiment. So we're talking about adding an acid plus a metal. Do you guys know what's gonna happen when we do that? It's gonna explode. Do you think it's gonna bubble? It is gonna bubble. When you add an acid and a metal, the metal's gonna act like the base. You're gonna form salt, but you're also gonna form a gas, slightly different gas. You're gonna form hydrogen gas. So you're gonna see bubbles again, but it's gonna be for a different reason. So I just wanna point out, so that way if you're gonna write your discussion, you can explain that. The other thing to think about when you write your discussion is concentration, because we're testing out different concentrations of acid. So think about the cordial experiment that we did at the very beginning with the what was it, Thrifty? And you had 0.5, 1, 2, and 4. think about that one and how that relates to concentration when you guys are thinking about discussions. All right. What questions do you have?
None.
None? You think you can be ready to write a discussion next week?
No.
Yeah, I think you can. All right, I'm going to pause the recording here. I'll leave this up on the board for those that still need the notes. And I'll recap today's lesson.
Are we done?
We're done. We're done.
We're done.
Yes.
All right, so just to recap today's lesson, we talked about designing our own chemistry investigation assessment, which we have ticked off. You guys should know how acids and bases behave. You should know about neutralization reactions and how to do some of these word equations. And you should be able to carry out a chemistry investigation. So really great work again today, guys. I think I saw everyone had written down notes. Make sure to spray and wipe down the tables, close the windows, put up your chairs. Great work again today, guys.